President Trump's long-awaited meeting with China's leader Xi Jinping has resulted in some success for both sides, with agreements on rare earth minerals and tariffs. But while these deals may be a welcome sign of diplomatic engagement, Trump's unexpected order to start nuclear weapons testing again, for the first time in 33 years, grabbed the bigger headlines. Matt Pottinger served as the president's deputy national security advisor during his first term, and he was a particularly influential voice regarding the administration's China policy. And he's joining the program live now from Utah. Matt Pottinger, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Christiane. Good to be with you.
So tell me, is this a big deal? Give me the sort of the wins and loses, if any, on what Xi got, what Trump got, what China got, what the U.S. got out of their meeting.
Yeah, so this is the first time that President Trump has met in person with Xi Jinping in 6 years. It was back in Osaka at the G20 in 2019 that they last met. So I would call it sort of a fragile truce on trade matters that came out of this. China is not going forward with its most draconian threat, which was to regulate all trade between all nations so long as goods contain trace amounts of Chinese rare earths. And of course, a lot of technology that matters do contain Chinese rare earths. So that would have been a very extreme step by China that would have led to a global recession. And at the same time, President Trump has agreed to withhold implementing further tariffs on China. In fact, he even agreed to repeal some of his new tariffs, about 10 percentage points of his tariffs on China, as sort of a down payment on the idea that China is going to finally rein in its state subsidized support for the fentanyl trade that is killing so many Americans. In fact, it's the leading cause of death for Americans between the age of, or at least men between the age of 18 and 49. So this looks to me like a fragile truce, Christiane.
Okay, so that's interesting. And just one quick question about the American farmers, because I think China agreed also, at least I don't know for how long, but to start buying American soybeans again, correct?
That's right. That's sort of coming back to where they were in a sense. That maybe they'll go beyond their typical purchases, but it's been in recent months that China completely zeroed out purchases of American soybeans as a way to acquire leverage for talks, and the leverage worked. You know, it was one of the things President Trump asked for. He's getting that, but he's also made some concessions. The tariffs on fentanyl. President Trump's agreed to withhold not just new tariffs, but also some of the new rules that his Commerce Department had put in that would have prevented American companies from doing business with about 20,000 Chinese companies that might have military ties and the like. So some concessions on both sides.
So let's just step back a little bit from the details and try to figure out what was the strategy here. Now, Jonathan Zinn, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, has said, I think it's an approach that can safely be described as tactics without a strategy. Ostensibly, the goal was to address some of the meaty trade issues that had long bedeviled the relationship. Instead, the PRC, China, has successfully orchestrated a game of whack-a-mole for the Trump administration. So the question from me to you is, did President Trump sort of start this trade war by the tariffs he put on and all the rest of it? Xi then hit back. He didn't bend. He hit back on what you say, rare minerals and soy. Now they've got back to status quo ante. Is that a correct reading of the situation?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, remember the big sort of salvo in this trade war was back in April, when President Trump did his Liberation Day tariffs, reciprocal tariffs with the world. There was only one country that retaliated rather than going straight into negotiations. That was the People's Republic of China. President Trump counter-escalated all the way up to 145% tariffs on China, which his Treasury Secretary rightly described as a trade embargo on China. Now, what did China do next? It began to cut off the flow of rare earths and the magnets, the permanent magnets that are made from rare earths that go into everything. They go into computers, they go into military equipment, they go into electronics and phones and the like. After that happened, President Trump came all the way back down to where basically a 30% tariff rate on China. So that told Beijing that they had found a pressure point that works. And so they recycled that pressure.
Yeah.
They began to apply it again and again and again in order to back President Trump off from some of his more aggressive trade moves.
Okay, so where does this leave the United States now in terms of relative strength vis-a-vis China? These are two superpowers. Well, one is an ascendant power, and Xi makes no bones about wanting to surpass the United States on all fronts, economic, military, and trade, and all the rest of it. You've recently written in the Free Press that the summit will determine, quote, whether America will remain a technological superpower or, if Xi gets his way, becomes an agrarian commune beholden to Beijing. You also talk about the idea of allowing NVIDIA to sell artificial intelligence chips to China. That would be tantamount to a U.S. capitulation, not only on trade, but also on technological supremacy. And apparently, according to the New York Times, Trump didn't rule that possibility out during the summit, the NVIDIA thing. So where are we on this? Because it's crucial to the relative dominance of the U.S., correct?
That's right. If President Trump had given indications that he was toying with the idea of talking to China about selling the most advanced U.S. AI chips, the NVIDIA B30A, which is basically as good. If you have two of them, it's as good as the most advanced chip that American companies use. So it looked like President Trump might be putting that on the table. In fact, though, it doesn't seem to have come up in the actual meeting with Xi Jinping. I'm very glad that it didn't. I'm glad that there was no concession by the U.S. on that part, because the implications would be so severe. Now, when I was talking about this idea that if Xi Jinping gets his way, we go back to being an agrarian country. The stakes really are that high, and it was something that the Chinese then Premier Li Keqiang, laid out for President Trump back in 2017. I was staffing President Trump when we visited Beijing in 2017, and Premier Li Keqiang came out and said, "Look, here's what's going to happen in the not too distant future. China's going to dominate all technology. The world will be more dependent than ever on China. China's going to beat the U.S. at AI. And the United States isn't going to sell China anything except for corn and soybeans when China is happy with how the U.S. is behaving."
Whoa.
So this was a bit of psychological warfare by the premier to say, we're going to win the future, so you might as well surrender now. The thing is, if we were to actually give up the advantages that we still have technologically, including in AI, it would put us on course to where we're pretty much just talking soybeans with China, and we become increasingly dependent on China.
So that I find really interesting, again, in the context of a foreign affairs essay. It was titled China Against China, arguing essentially that there's a sort of a difference in American diplomats and political analysts' view of China. Now, is China actually more resilient than Washington gives it credit for, or is China a paper tiger on the brink of economic problems and this and that? And so do you feel that there's a division inside? Yeah. Tell me what that'll lead to.
Yeah, look, I think there's truth to this. When you look at China, you almost have to have a split screen in mind, because two things are true simultaneously. On the one hand, China is actually achieving many of its goals in dominating really critical technologies this century. They dominate us in EVs. They dominate us in batteries, solar manufacturing. China's manufacturing base is now double that of the United States. 20 years ago, it was the opposite. We were double China. So all of those things are real. That's not paper tiger. On the other hand, China's overall economy is not going to be carried by just really, by making EVs. The consumer economy is a shambles. The overall economy probably is not growing. China claims, low to mid single digit growth. In real terms, a lot of economists I know think that China is actually shrinking in real terms, becoming a smaller economy in global terms and relative to the United States. Unemployment is off the charts. Many times they don't even report some of their statistics because they're so bad. Both things are true simultaneously. It is a centrally controlled economy that is having big success in the areas that they're grossly over subsidizing. And then it's failing in so many of the other key components of what would make for a normal economy. So,
Yeah.
if the U.S. doesn't lose its nerve, I still think that this is our race to lose.
Yeah.
We have more natural advantages, but it's going to be a close run thing.
Okay, so and if the U.S. doesn't lose its alliances, because that also is, exponential power to confront China. And it's been said that Trump, with all his tariffs and his demands and demanding hundreds of billions of dollars of Japanese and South Korean and other money to be invested in the U.S., is somewhat destabilizing their economies. He's basically alienating the very allies he needs to be tough with him on China. Do you buy that? Do you think he did enough on this trip to shore up his alliances?
Well, look, yeah, I think that there's, with no doubt, I mean, his approach on tariffs creates friction with a lot of allies. But at the same time, remember when President Trump came back into office, a lot of people were concerned that he was going to take a really hard isolationist bent. And in fact, that's not what's really happened in the first 9 months or so that he's been in office. He went to NATO in June and left, basically re-embracing the organization. NATO allies agreed to more than double their spending as a percentage of GDP over the next decade. He has not turned his back on Ukraine. Ukraine's still getting access to U.S. weapons as long as Europe's paying for them. The Middle East, I mean, when President Biden came into office, Arab Gulf states were really quite upset with the approach that he was taking. And now I think there's a much higher degree of comfort. We might see President Trump achieve a new Abraham Accord sometime in his term, going beyond the three peace agreements he made between Israel and Sunni Arab states. So both things can be true there as well. There's friction in the relationship on trade, but at the end of the day, there's no one other than the United States there to serve as the key guarantor of peace and security.
Exactly.
And President Trump is just asking them to carry a bigger part of that burden. And I think that's now happening.
So just another question then related to this, but also related to what's happening in Venezuela. The administration has decided that there is a war on Venezuela. There's an aircraft carrier. There's been all these strikes on these boats. It's all obviously non-declared in Congress. But nonetheless, I want to ask you what you think. If China is the big issue, it's said that President Trump's diplomat, Richard Grenell, had this negotiation whereby Maduro, the dictator there, had agreed to allow the United States into all its natural resources and furthermore expel and end its cooperation with China, Iran, Cuba, all the countries that America considers suspect. And that didn't happen. Instead, it went from diplomacy to war. Is that a missed opportunity, or do you think it's appropriate to go belligerent in Venezuela?
Yeah, I don't think that we should be. We've tried, sort of an appeasement policy towards Chavez and then Maduro. I don't think it turned out well for our foreign policy. It certainly didn't turn out well for the Venezuelan people. The Venezuela's economy was the strongest in Latin America. It's now fallen 80% from where it was. Millions of people have fled Venezuela. So President Trump, it's interesting. President Trump, when he talks about distant countries, he doesn't usually talk in ideological terms, in Cold War terms. When he's talking about America's near abroad, if you like, the Caribbean, Latin America, he sounds much more like a Cold Warrior. He gave a major address in 2020 where he talked about looking forward to the day when Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela would be free countries. So I think President Trump has pushed aside the idea of some kind of a détente with Venezuela, and that's why you're seeing the gunboat diplomacy. Whether he goes farther than he's gone is anybody's guess right now. But I think he's quite intent on trying to pressure Maduro into stepping down and then restoring democracy. By the way, Maduro lost.
Yes, of course.
Last
yes.
year by something like 70 to 30%. That's the proven, and that doesn't even include all the people who fled who would have voted against him. But of course, he overturned the election illegally. So I think that we shouldn't rule out that President Trump might take even tougher steps down the line.
And actually, to your point, we've had the opposition leader, the Nobel Prize winner, tell us that she believes that that election would have been regime change had the results been respected, that there wouldn't be Maduro as president, that she or her colleagues would have been, and that she supports that action by the U.S. administration. So, Matt Pottinger, thank you. And we'll come back to you for more analysis of this administration down the road. Thank you so much.